Thank you, Carla, for this kind introduction. And thank you also to the research projects Adapting Canadian Work and Workplaces and Work in a Warming World for inviting me to Toronto to do this lecture and the brainstorm that we also will have tomorrow. I'm very grateful for the opportunity, so thank you for that. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a real privilege to speak to you today about the landmark decision that was rendered in the Netherlands on the 24th of June by the Hague District Court in the case, as mentioned by Carla, in the case of the Urgenda Foundation versus the State of the Netherlands. And as the case name makes clear, the plaintiff in this case, that is the main plaintiff in this case, that I had the privilege to represent is the Dutch Urgenda Foundation. And for your information, the Urgenda Foundation is a non-for-profit organization with the statutory aim to facilitate and accelerate the transformation to a sustainable society in the Netherlands and abroad. And its director is Marjan Minnesma, and she's widely considered as one of the leading people in the field of climate change and sustainable development in the Netherlands. Now let me first start with shortly explaining to you how this successful climate case against the Dutch government came about. It all started with a book I wrote that was published in 2011. It's a book on climate change and the detrimental effects of the stalemate position in politics in addressing climate change. And it describes how, in my opinion, we could use the law as a lever to press governments into more adequate climate action and into more adequate climate policies. I have to open the drawer here and use, well, like this, yeah. In 2012, my book was translated into English and titled Revolution Justified and subtitled with the words, Why Only the Law Can Save Us Now. And Urgenda's director, Marjan Minnesma, was one of the first people to read it. And she rang me one day and told me it was one of the best books she had read in years, which was obviously very pleasant for me to hear. And she proposed to use the book for an Urgenda campaign, and so she did. She sent over 1,000 copies of the book to all members of parliament, to our government, to the royal family, to universities, strategic think tanks, the CEOs of large Dutch companies, the mayors of big cities, etc., etc. And she urged them to read the book for a better understanding of the dangers that the political deadlock situation around climate change poses for societies around the world, including our own, and for a better understanding of the urgency that is involved if we are to prevent large-scale human rights infringements around the globe. So she invited the recipients of the book to respond to it and enter into a dialogue with Urgenda on the matter, and sure enough, many did, and amongst them our own government. And in its letter to Urgenda, the government confirmed the importance of adequately addressing climate change and also acknowledged that more action is needed. But basically said the same thing most governments are saying when urged to take more climate action. And that is that climate change is an international problem, that it requires an international solution, and that it should be dealt with on the international stage, not just in national politics and let alone in a national courtroom. So there were further exchanges of letters between Urgenda and the government, and even a meeting was convened, but in 2013 it became increasingly clear that nothing would change in our national climate policies, at least not until at least 2020. And that's when Marjan and I decided to file a suit against the Dutch government, using the approach as described in my book as a starting point, and asking the court to impose an obligation on the state to limit the joint volume of Dutch annual greenhouse gases by at least 25% in 2020 relative to 1990 levels. And now, 2 years later, we can thankfully say that our approach worked and generated a groundbreaking and precedent-setting success for the climate movement, because the court indeed ordered the Dutch government to limit the greenhouse gases by at least 25% in 2020. And the court considered the current Dutch climate policies inadequate and unlawful and labeled them as hazardous negligence and as a violation of the state's duty of care. It is truly an historic decision. Now the case was reported because of this historic nature of the decision, the case was reported by the media around the world, from Al Jazeera to the New York Times, and from the Chinese National News Agency to the Toronto Star. It is recognized that if more courts will start to intervene in climate change-related cases, that this could have quite an impact on climate policies around the world and on the way climate change is perceived by the general public. And in that respect, it's worth mentioning that a similar case is already pending now in our neighboring country, Belgium. Now, for the rest of my presentation, it roughly consists of 4 parts. In the first part, I will discuss some of the aspects of climate science that were relevant for the outcome of these proceedings. And second, I will focus on the main legal argumentation that we submitted to the court and that was followed by the court in its ruling. In the third part, I will reflect on what we can learn from the Urgenda approach and the ruling of the court. How did it help to engage civil society in the climate change debate? What are the consequences of the ruling for stakeholders such as labor unions? And what role could and maybe should labor unions play in tackling climate change? I will discuss these discussions later on, and I will subsequently conclude with the relevance of this case in a broader context. Now I will start with the legal status of the IPCC. Our approach with respect to the climate science in this case was to convince the court that the climate science as presented by the IPCC cannot be disputed in court because it has exceptional evidentiary value and therefore a unique legal status. The IPCC is, as you probably know, the abbreviation for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a UN body that analyzes and researches all peer-reviewed climate science. And the reason for the unique legal status of IPCC reports is because the manner in which these reports are drafted and produced mirrors the legal process of hearing all arguments from all sides before making a judgment. It mirrors the principle of fair hearing and due process. The IPCC is open to all scientists, it's open to all governments around the world, and it's obligated to include in its analysis all scientific studies. Also the fact that the IPCC draft reports are subject to a system of dual review in which they are first assessed and screened by external panels of scientists and later by all the member states to the Climate Convention gives them a special status, all the more because the final text of the summary for policymakers is line by line approved by the General Assembly of member states. So the IPCC system of hearing all arguments and this comprehensive and very sophisticated production process gives the assessment reports of the IPCC a unique legal status, which Rhoda Verheyen also underlined in her book Climate Change, Damage and International Law. And to quote her, "No court of law could possibly deviate from IPCC findings, since any expertise put before the court would never be as inclusive as that inherent in the IPCC." Now important is that the Dutch state agreed with this and did not in any way contest the findings of the IPCC and indeed acknowledged these findings fully and completely. So now we know what the legal standing of IPCC reports is. Let us have a look at some of the findings of the IPCC. And there are a lot of conclusions that are drawn by the IPCC with a high degree of certainty and confidence. And just to name a few. The IPCC reports state that we know for 100% sure that the Earth is warming since the Industrial Revolution. And we also know for 100% sure that the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has substantially increased since the Industrial Revolution due to mankind. This is an increase of about 40%. We know for 95% sure that these two 100% certainties are interlinked to one another, meaning that the increase of man-made CO2 and the increase in other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere are the main cause of the observed warming. And we know for 90% sure that all regions in the world will be adversely affected with a rise of more than 2 degrees Celsius of the average temperature of the Earth. And we also know for 90% sure that the observed warming of the average temperature of the Earth is about 0.8 degrees up till now. Now this temperature rise of 0.8 degrees warming, it doesn't seem like much, but it has already set quite some changes in motion. At current temperatures, already 50% of the summer ice cover has disappeared at the North Pole in the last 40 years. There's also a noticeable increase of extreme events, weather events on land, such as prolonged droughts, intense heat waves, floods, bushfires, etc. Our oceans are acidifying, and coral reefs, the nurseries of much marine life, are bleaching. And these are just some of the adverse effects of climate change already observed with a temperature rise of 0.8 degrees Celsius. Now, what's occurring in relation to 0.8 degrees Celsius is already troublesome, but it's becoming even more so once we understand that there's a lot more warming coming that we can't avoid anymore. And that is because there's a certain inertia in the climate system, and this is a very important point, I think. It means that it takes decades before emitted CO2 reaches its full warming potential. And what that means is that changes that we are witnessing today in the world, such as the melting of the North Pole, those changes are not a result of today's emissions, but they are mainly the result of the emissions of the past, of emissions of up to around 1980. The CO2 that has been emitted after 1980 and until today still has to reach its full warming potential. So there's much more warming in the pipeline already, there's much more warming coming that we can't avoid anymore, even if we were to stop using all fossil fuels tomorrow. But on top of that, we also know that we will add a lot more CO2 to the atmosphere in the future, because we are nowhere near of becoming independent of fossil fuels, as it will take many more decades to transform the world's current energy structures to sustainable ones, guaranteeing an even further unavoidable warming. And obviously, the longer it takes us to transition away from fossil fuels, the larger the unavoidable extra warming will be. Now, keeping these scientific findings and observation in mind, let's have a look at what the central objective of the global community is with respect to tackling climate change. Now, the ultimate objective of the UN Climate Convention that was drafted in 1992 and to which 195 countries are a party is defined in Article 2 of the Convention. And the Convention defines the central objective as follows, and I quote: "The ultimate objective of this convention is to achieve stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system." So the central objective is prevention of dangerous man-made climate change. And then the question is, when does climate change become dangerous? Now, the answer to this very relevant question was given during the climate conference in Cancun in 2010 in Mexico, where the 195 signatories to the Climate Convention have stated in the so-called Cancun agreements, and I quote again, that deep cuts in global greenhouse gas emissions are required according to science and as documented in the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so as to hold the increase in global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius above in pre-industrial levels, and that parties should take urgent action to meet that long-term goal. Now, what a 2 degrees rise would mean, amongst other things, is a dangerous extent of sea level rise, of loss of biodiversity, of degradations of ecosystems, of extreme weather events, and of loss of food and fresh water supplies, which in turn will lead to the migration of people whose land will become too parched or become inundated or too wet to sustain themselves. And this will in turn induce huge security issues around the globe. Now, to give you an example, the displacement of people due to climate change is likely already occurring. There is evidence that the 2007 till 2011 extreme drought and heat in Syria contributed to the conflict in Syria. Amongst others, the National Academy of Sciences of the US has reported about this phenomenon. This prolonged Syrian drought was the worst drought on record, caused widespread crop failure and a mass migration of farming families to urban centers where many of them ended up in poverty. It created hotspots for social unrest. So in a way, the conflict in Syria and the resulting refugee crisis in Europe, which is the biggest since World War II, can already be linked to the warming of our planet. And then there's the other danger that is related to 2 degrees, and that is that there's a real danger of reaching certain tipping points that would accelerate the warming beyond repair and control, and beyond the adaptive capabilities and capacities of nature and humans alike. Now, such tipping points are the release of methane stocks locked up in the frozen tundra of the world that could be released when tundras start to defrost. Other tipping points could be the melting of the ice masses on Greenland and the Antarctic, or the parching of the Amazon forest. So the universal goal is to stay below 2 degrees to avoid the gravest of consequences, but we are still far away from reaching that goal. And that is why science, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Energy Agency, and even globally operating accountancy firms like PricewaterhouseCoopers, and not least recently the Pope, have been ringing the alarm bells over the last years, warning us that if we don't start to drastically phase out fossil fuels, we are heading for a world that will warm with 3 to 5 degrees at this century alone. It prompted the IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde to say during the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I quote her, "Unless we take action on climate change, future generations will be roasted, toasted, fried and grilled." So the question then is what mitigation efforts are needed to stay below a warming of the average temperature of the Earth by 2 degrees? Now let's have a look at some of the statements that are made on this topic, made respectively by the European Union, the Netherlands, and the joint industrialized nations of this world, including Canada. And here is a first quote from a communication of the European Commission to the European Council, and I quote, "The EU's objective is to limit average temperature increase to less than 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. By stabilizing long-term concentrations at around 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent, there's a 50% chance of doing so." Now this mentioned 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent means that from every million atoms in the atmosphere, a maximum of 450 of them could be greenhouse gases. And here's a quote from the Netherlands National Environmental Agency on the same matter. "Emission reduction targets of 25 to 40% below 1990 levels in 2020 would be consistent with stabilizing long-term greenhouse gas concentration levels at 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent. This concentration level has a reasonable chance of 50% of avoiding an increase in global average temperature of more than 2 degrees Celsius. So we need substantial reductions by 2020 in the range of 25 to 40% to stay on course to have a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees. And this need for drastic reductions by 2020 is also acknowledged in a joint declaration by the industrialized nations of the world, again including Canada, also called the Annex I countries, jointly stating in 2010 during the climate conference in Cancun, and I quote again, "Achieving the lowest levels assessed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to date," which is a referral to the 450 scenario, "and its corresponding potential damage limitation would require Annex 1 parties as a group to reduce emissions in the range of 25 to 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. So it's rather clear what needs to be done, but Annex 1 developed countries are not even coming close to these reduction percentages that are required by 2020. And just to give you a reference, Canada will probably be 26% above 1990 levels in 2020. So consequently, reaching the 450 parts per million threshold is something that might occur in the next 2 to 3 decades, and in worst case, it might even occur in 15 years from now. Because this is what the IPCC had to say about it in its 2014 report. Baseline scenarios, that is scenarios without explicit additional efforts to constrain emissions, exceed 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent by 2030. So we really need explicit additional efforts to avoid this threshold. Also much more efforts than the combined non-binding pledges that countries have submitted to the UN prior to the forthcoming climate summit in Paris. So there can only be one conclusion, and that is that urgent and very ambitious action is necessary. But the required action is not forthcoming. And this puts us all, and especially the younger generation and future generations, at grave danger. And that begs the question, can this inaction be legally justified? Can states knowingly and willingly stay inactive, knowing and acknowledging that this will create grave danger for us all? Now, before discussing some of the arguments that convinced the court that this behavior cannot be justified, first some other considerations that are of interest to know. To again give you a relevant quote from the United Nations Cancun Agreement on Climate Change of 2010, and I quote, "Climate change represents an urgent and potentially irreversible threat to human societies, and climate change-related impacts have a range of implications, both direct and indirect, for the effective enjoyment of human rights, inter alia the right to life." Now, such a broad acknowledgement of all nation-states of the world on the relation between climate change and human rights speaks for itself. Now, this connection between climate change and the right to life has also already been made by the European Court of Justice, and in one of its rulings, the court stated that emissions of greenhouse gases are amongst the main causes of climate change, and it should be noted that climate policy is also designed to protect the health and life of humans. And then there is the US Supreme Court ruling in the case of Massachusetts versus EPA that might still be the most important legal climate case to this point. It's a case from the United States. And most of you, or many of you might probably be acquainted with this ruling, but in short, the EPA had refused to rule on whether CO2 and other greenhouse gases are air pollutants, although the state of Massachusetts and other states had requested EPA for such a ruling. And in the end, the Supreme Court said that EPA had an obligation enshrined in the Clean Air Act to make such a ruling, as it eventually did. Now, during these proceedings, and this is interesting, EPA had tried to evade its responsibility, amongst others claiming that there is no point in making such a ruling for the US, because no matter what the EPA or the US would do, the growth of greenhouse gas emissions in emerging economies such as China would easily undo any efforts in the US to curb such emissions. The court did not agree and ruled otherwise, and considered that a reduction in domestic emissions would slow the pace of global emission increases, no matter what happens elsewhere. So no matter what happens in India or China or any other country, there is an individual responsibility to act. Now here are some other noteworthy findings of the Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court, in this EPA case, and I quote three of them. The harms associated with climate change are serious and well recognized. The risk of catastrophic harm, though remote, is nevertheless real, and EPA's steadfast refusal to regulate greenhouse gas emissions presents a risk of harm to Massachusetts that is both actual and imminent. And it was particularly this last line of reasoning by the US Supreme Court that got me thinking that the refusal of governments to act prudently against the dangers of climate change might qualify as a breach of the duty of care and might therefore constitute a tort of negligence. And when the much anticipated climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009 failed in reaching an international agreement, I knew that something had to be done and that I had to start finding a way to use the law to the advantage of addressing the climate change problem. And that's when I brought on my research, wrote the book Revolution Justified, and in the end started the proceedings in the Netherlands. Now, from a legal perspective, the Dutch climate case centers on the duty of care. And one could say that the duty of care consists of the more or less universal criteria for the reasonable man standard, and that is the standard of an average careful person, private person or legal person, duly balancing risk and care and taking into account all circumstances of the case. Now, states are like private actors bound by the duty of care. The criteria that are relevant in the Netherlands to define whether a person, private or public, has a duty of care are the following. How apparent is the danger? How great is the chance that the danger will manifest itself? How serious is the danger and its consequences? What is the extent of the measure of responsibility of the defendant versus the claimant, the so-called proximity question? And how objectionable is it? Is our total preventive? Is it to take preventive measures? Now, these five Dutch criteria, are comparable to the criteria in other Western countries. Then let's now have a look at how to apply these criteria in the case of climate change. And the following was our position in court and was carried by the court in its ruling. Now, the first criterion with regard to the appearance of the danger. We argue that the danger line is universally set at 2 degrees Celsius, and it's therefore apparent to all. It's a political consensus-based decision that is in itself based on sound IPCC science. Now, the second question, how great is the chance that the danger will manifest itself? The chance of reaching the 2-degree limit is great because the general consensus based on science is that we are heading for a world that will be warmer than 2 degrees by the end of this century. Now, the third question, how serious is the danger? As the Supreme Court has put it, the US Supreme Court, the risk of catastrophic harm is real, and therefore nobody should doubt the seriousness of the dangers involved. And then the fourth question, the measure of responsibility of the defendant. Now, the question here is there a relation of proximity between the state and the claimants that make it fair, just and reasonable to impose a duty upon the government to act adequately upon climate change? Now, the court did not find it very hard to answer this question because by entering the UN Climate Convention, the state has accepted a national responsibility for the joint volume of greenhouse gases in the Netherlands. According to the court, this responsibility of the state for national emission levels also follows from the fact that the state has in fact set national targets for emission reductions. And it also has effective control over the situation because the state is equipped with the legal instruments to steer and lead society to a low carbon economy. It can enact legislation, tax carbon, design cap and trade schemes, enter into covenants with public and private parties, provide for subsidies, and so on. So it is fair, just, and reasonable that the state has a duty of care to act upon climate change, the court argued. In this regard, the court also mentioned the legal obligations enshrined in the Dutch constitutions and several other treaties. They all charge the government with a general duty to protect citizens from environmental harm. Therefore, the argument, and this was an important argument for the state, the argument of the state in our proceedings stating that the real emitters are businesses and citizens and not the state itself, failed. Now, this position was brought forward by the state to argue that it does not have a legal relevant responsibility for climate change. But the court dismissed this argument because, according to the court, the government may not point to businesses and citizens and hide behind them, holding them solely responsible for climate change. The government has an overall systemic responsibility for the joint volume of greenhouse gases emitted within its territory. So the court found that the state indeed plays a crucial role in the transition to a more sustainable society and therefore has to take on a high level of care for establishing an adequate and effective framework to reduce greenhouse gases. And let me add to this on a personal note that, in my opinion, this finding of the court makes perfect sense because history tells us that it is primarily governments and not markets or citizens that play the most pivotal role in building our energy networks. Since the invention of electricity, for instance, the electricity networks have typically been built and financed by national and regional governments who today still own most of these networks. At least in Europe this has been the case. The same is true for the power stations that have been built since the late 19th century. They too were built and financed by governments in Europe. And I believe Canada's electricity sector has a similar history. So our governments have been responsible for creating and establishing the generation, transmittance and distribution of electricity. It's only in the last 20 to 15 years that governments have been engaged in privatizing power stations by selling them off to private companies. But still, looking at Europe, the nuclear power plants in France are still government-owned, and many of the gas and coal-fired power plants in the Netherlands and in Europe are also still government-owned. And while it is true that the United States electricity sector has a somewhat different history, in which private companies like General Electric played a larger role from the beginning, it still was not the market mechanism that turned generating electricity into a large-scale industry. Quite the contrary. General Electric managed to acquire a monopoly position on electricity production from federal and state governments, thereby automatically cancelling out the market mechanism and any form of competition. And it was this monopoly position that actually made it possible for the company to garner sufficient means to fund the huge capital investments needed to build electricity plants and roll out an electricity network. And precisely the fact that federal and state governments stepped in to disable the market mechanism gave the American electricity sector the push it needed to grow. Now, not only did governments build the electricity sector, they also built our road infrastructure so the automotive sector could grow. They built seaports and airports, paving the way for further development of international transportation and so on. And the oil industry owes much of its growth due to the long-term government investment in these infrastructures. So what I'm saying is that there are many ways to motivate why the court's conclusion that governments play a vital role in building and transforming energy systems is a correct one. Therefore, governments have a special duty of care in addressing climate change. The market is simply unable to transform our energy system without this much needed government direction and intervention. Now let's have a look at the fifth criteria and the last criteria. The question remains whether from an objective stance the requested order to reduce emissions by at least 25% in 2020 is to be considered too onerous, too objectionable for the state, because the state should not be expected to do the impossible, and nor may, from a legal perspective, a disproportionately high burden be placed upon it. So is a reduction of at least 25% objectionable? That was a very central question in our court case. And here we have to keep in mind that countries like Denmark and Germany, for instance, have their target set on no less than a 40% reduction in 2020, more than double the effort of the Netherlands that has its target set at just 60% in 2020. Now, Denmark and Germany are well on their way to reach these targets, and their economies are doing just fine, as are their businesses. Except for Volkswagen, maybe, but that's a different story. They carry out this ambitious climate policy because they are convinced that this is necessary to stay below 2 degrees, and because they are also convinced that it is possible to reach this target and prosper as an economy. And both countries do. They are highly innovative, have created a lot of new jobs in the green industry, have become more energy independent and more energy secure. Their use of energy is more efficient, and so on. These countries have adopted long-term targets and planning for transitioning to an almost carbon-neutral society by 2050. They have a public support base for doing so because their governments have been actively generating that support base by explaining and communicating the necessity to transform. They actively work on reskilling the workforce. They work with labor unions to implement ambitious programs to reduce energy use. They view climate policy as an integral approach that needs efforts from all ministries in all policy fields, and they make sure that the topic remains high on the political agenda. Now, these countries, and also countries like the United Kingdom and Sweden, who are also frontrunners in climate change policies, show that climate change is primarily about political will. The court took these high reduction targets of the frontrunners in climate change into account when deciding that a reduction of 25% in 2020 is not a disproportionately high burden on the state, given, and this is also important, given what is at stake when the 2-degree threshold will be breached. The court decided that such a target is feasible, also given the fact that the state did not argue that 25% would be a disproportional burden or not be cost effective when compared to slower reduction scenarios. The court acknowledged that even if the transformation will have adverse effect on some industries, and even if there will be some strain on government budgets, that the gravity of a world of 2 degrees or more is considered to be such that, according to the court, it justifies the fact that mitigation measures have to be taken, even if they are onerous and burdensome in some ways. If the Dutch ruling is an indication what is to come, I think that any developed nation state would have a hard time proving that they can't contribute in a way the Danes, the Germans, and the English are contributing to solving the problem, be it through ambitious targets for 2020 or new targets for 2030. Now, the foregoing has been the line of reasoning that the court followed on the duty of care, and on the grounds of which the court held basically that, given the high risk of a 2-degree warming, the state has a duty to take measures to help prevent it. And reductions of at least 25% in 2020 are not disproportional and are feasible according to the court. The court further held that it's not decisive that reductions in the Netherlands will have a minor effect on a global scale. The court held that it is a scientific fact that every emission contributes to the rise in global concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that no single country is solely responsible for the danger. But together we are, and therefore the Netherlands should contribute to solving the issue. And this is in line with the US Supreme Court's argumentation in the EPA case that we just mentioned. So, what can we learn from our approach and the ruling of the court What did it generate, and what are the consequences of the ruling for stakeholders within Dutch society? Well, first of all, the mere fact that we brought the case to court in 2013 was big news in the Dutch media. It alone already generated a renewed impulse for broader public debate about climate change. And once the verdict was passed, this debate obviously intensified in all directions, making it a news item for weeks in a row, resulting in parliamentary debates and hearings. Letters were sent to our Prime Minister by groups of established scientists, by groups of corporations and groups of NGOs to request government not to appeal the case, to respect the science and the court's view, and to show global leadership by accepting the court's ruling. Even political parties in Parliament joined this request to not appeal the case, and also a spontaneous mass Twitter bombardment to our Prime Minister occurred under the hashtag #DoNotAppeal. Newspapers and news networks have been discussing measures that could be taken to reach the 25% goal. Policy institutions, academics and business associations issued their own analysis of how to best achieve the new target. And eventually the government did commit to the new 25% target set by the court, but also went ahead with the appeal proceedings because it felt that a higher court should review the ruling. So on the one hand, we have now a pending appeal, while on the other hand, the government will present its plans to Parliament in the first half of 2016 for reaching this new 25% target. So in short, it's safe to say that the climate case has put climate policies high on the political agenda, has created new analysis and ideas for enhancing Dutch climate policies, and has engaged a lot of people and institutions in wanting to do more about climate change. Now, this engagement and involvement from civil society is obviously an important factor in making new climate policies successful. And with regard to the engagement of civil society, it is important to note that notwithstanding the court's verdict, stakeholders such as businesses, labor unions, and NGOs in the Netherlands obviously retain the possibility to be engaged in a dialogue with the political branches. A dialogue that can still influence climate policies to meet the needs of their respective support bases, but, and this is an important point, these dialogues can no longer postpone climate policies. This clarity that further postponing the transformation of our energy generation and energy use is no longer allowed has the benefit of altering the discussion from if and when to how. How do we create public support for what is deemed necessary? How do we best incentivize the development of a clean energy sector? How are we going to transition from brown jobs to green jobs? What expertise is required in these green jobs? How do we adapt our education system to meet this demand for new labor? But also, how do we assist the fossil fuel industry in continuing the production of fossil fuels that are needed to perform the transformation on the one hand, whilst at the same time assisting them in adapting to this new reality that urges them to reinvent themselves and their activities for their longer-term survival. And that's why, for instance, an oil multinational like Royal Dutch Shell is transforming itself from an oil company to a gas company, because their view is that natural gas is the cleanest of fossil fuels and therefore the best suited to assist this transition phase to a carbon-neutral world. Now, these are just some of the big questions that need to be answered, and it's clear to me that answering them also needs the involvement of labor unions. These questions have a direct link to job creation, to job adaptation, and to job protection. These are questions that touch upon the very reason why labor unions have been established in the first place. Also, the labor unions can help to push the government to more climate action and help creating a transition to green jobs. They can help the government in setting priorities. But obviously, labor unions and their workers can also begin by proactively greening their environment at work and in the wider society on their own behalf. At the very least, unions and their workers are in a unique position to help combat climate change, and here's why. In industrialized countries, labor unions are usually the largest member associations in civil society. They know how to organize and reach out within their ranks, within their communities, to individuals, to civil society organizations, and others. They know how to bring people to action and ally with a wide range of civil society organizations. Also, unions can negotiate with their employers to adapt the labor process to reduce greenhouse gas emissions through collective bargaining or through other means, which might even include legal action against employers. For instance, by using the occupational health and safety laws to its fullest extent by linking greenhouse gas emissions to health threats. The influence of unions cannot be underestimated, and it would be a very valuable move if this influence is deployed for helping to achieve the global climate target. By doing so, unions will probably reinvent themselves in different ways and become part of the institutional innovation that is as important as the technical innovation that is needed to combat climate change. Unions should embrace this role, I think, on behalf of themselves, their workers, future generations, and the future of labor itself, because there are no jobs on a dead planet. Now let me now conclude on the relevance of the climate case in a broader legal perspective. In this respect, I would like to quote Nelson Mandela, who once said, "It always seems impossible until it's done. And once it's done, it becomes easier to do it again, to replicate it." As we have seen in asbestos and tobacco lawsuits, momentum seems to be gained after an initial and thus historic ruling sets a precedent. It is almost a rule that more judgments will follow. Subsequent condemnatory rulings will then begin to change the public perception of the problem. 20 years ago, the idea of a ban on smoking in cafes or public buildings would have been unimaginable. After various court rulings, often based on occupational health and safety laws, it is now generally accepted that smokers should not be permitted to pose a risk to the health of others. And it is to be hoped that cases dealing with the climate change problem will follow the same course. And that is why this ruling, the first of its kind in the world, is so important, I think. It will hopefully help change the public perception of the problem, of the climate problem, and bring it in line with what climate scientists and international institutions, and as I said before, recently also the Pope, have been trying to make clear to us for so many years. And that is that climate change poses a major threat to all regions and societies of the world, including our very own. Like our governments, companies, labor unions, citizens, NGOs, and other stakeholders will have to do their share to stop climate change while the worst can still be avoided. And I think there's a lot to be gained by doing so. Thank you.
Why is it that we all share the same atmosphere? Why is it that the emissions since 1980 until today are not being felt by us today? Is it some sort of...
Because there's a delay. Can I answer this? Because I cannot write anything down. Because there's a delay between the emissions and the actual warming. you could compare it to entering into a house in wintertime when there's no warming and the house is pretty cold. Once you turn up the heat, then the radiator becomes warm at the touch almost instantly. But before your whole house is warmed, could maybe take a whole day or even 2 days. So there's this delay, and this also happens with the warming in the atmosphere before our land is warmed due to these additional emissions. It will take up to 30 to 50 years, and the actual effects on the ice masses in the oceans in the world even takes more than that. It could even take centuries. So that's why this is like a slow, like a tanker that you have to stop like 40 kilometers before you reach the port, because otherwise you will hit the docks, obviously. And this is the same case here. What we're seeing now is not the end of the emission of the results of the emissions up to today.
Great, thank you. May I ask one more quick question? Just one. Can you comment on the lawsuit against Exxon, potential proceedings against Exxon for their funding and organizing of deniers groups? Thank you.
Yeah, I noticed there's some investigation on that point. I don't think that the actual fact that you knew something, because I think governments have already also knew for decades that climate change is a real issue, because otherwise we wouldn't have the 1992 Climate Treaty, which already states that it's human-induced and that it's dangerous. But I think in the Exxon case, it's probably about hiding this information and bringing out information that is contrary to what you know is right. So that's probably what this case will be about. And I think that I've always thought, and I describe this in my book also, that it's at this point in time it's easier to sue governments for neglect in climate change policies. Because governments have, like we've seen in this presentation, have confirmed the science outright, have also accepted and acknowledged the 2-degree target, etc., etc. Companies could eventually maybe even try to hide behind this information, so could maybe argue that the science is not settled yet. Countries cannot do that anymore because they've already acknowledged all these. But an interesting development here is that we have this carbon bubble phenomena, which means that, and this is also something that's not disputed, it's information of the International Energy Agency, fossil fuel companies don't dispute it, but it's the phenomena that if we want to stay below 2 degrees, that we have to keep 4/5 of all the fossil fuel reserve that are already financially activated on the balance sheet of fossil fuel companies. We have to keep that underground. So that would mean that these assets that are used as securities for loans, etc., are not the assets that everybody thought they would be. And then you see these reactions of the fossil fuel companies, public reactions of fossil fuel companies, who don't deny this carbon bubble phenomena, but they just say, well, we don't expect that governments are in a position to regulate enough in short enough time to actually keep us under 2 degrees. So that's why our assets probably are not stranded, because the world will be a lot warmer than 2 degrees. And because of these public announcements by fossil fuel companies, I think that also could shift the balance in making it easier to hold them liable for their contribution to climate change, because they also acknowledge in these public letters that they acknowledge the 2-degree target now, but they just say, well, I don't expect governments to be able to regulate us, and therefore these assets are not stranded. So I think that we will see a shift of focus also to holding fossil fuel companies liable for their inaction in addressing the problem.
Okay. Donald Lafleur, Canadian Labour Congress. I got 2 questions. In your presentation, you didn't talk about the legal obligation of putting forth the impact in your homeland. Was that done? Is that an obligation? If other countries want to take this route? Do you think this is something that needs to be put forth as an argument? And my second question, do you know...
I'm not sure if I understand your first question.
Well, the first question is, did you put forth examples of what climate change would do at home?
Okay, yeah.
And the second question is, do you know if there's any organization, your government, planning on raising this great reality in Paris? I want to thank you for your presentation. It gives a lot of hope.
Okay. Well, on the first question, obviously a lot of effort went into showing what the consequences of climate change will be in a low-lying country like the Netherlands is. A lot of our country is situated below sea levels. Obviously, we have a good engineering crew in our country, so we are pretty much able to protect ourselves against certain sea level rises. But once sea level rises to a level that really becomes dangerous, then also even engineering has its limits. But like in any Western country, we also will have to cope and are already coping with more intense precipitation, flooding through flooding of rivers, heat stress related death already in the 2003 and 2006 summers. Our Ministry of Health has acknowledged that there are climate related deaths, a few hundreds of them, bushfires, etc. So we experience differences. Our temperature rise is a bit higher even than the average temperature rise in the Earth. So sure, we focused a lot on this, but we must not forget that it's not just about what happens within your own country. We are living in a globalized world where we are very much dependent on stability in other parts of the world, also for our food production, for our industries, etc. So crises in other parts of the world can really affect our well-being and our health in our own country. So, but yeah, sure, we put a lot of effort in that. And then the second question with regard to Paris, I forgot what that was. If it's being raised in Paris, well, not at the central stage in Paris, but there's a lot of side events always around climate summits, and we will be speaking there for a few days on several of those side events. Yeah. Okay, there's time for one more question.
Roger, thank you for your excellent presentation. I'm Josephine Yang from the Environmental Law Center of Alberta, and my question is, in climate change litigation, the problem is always showing causation. So, for example, an island is being inundated by rising sea levels. Then they say we're going to launch a suit against coal plants in the U.S. And coal plants in the U.S. say you cannot attribute your island being buried in the sea because of our GHG emissions. Because as we all know, climate change is a global problem and it all gets mixed up in the atmosphere. So how do you prove the link of causation for purposes of attributing liability?
Yeah, well, typically the causation question, and in these cases that have been instituted already with relation to climate change, have been asking for financial compensation, for instance. And once you ask compensation for damages done, you also have to prove that this damage was actually the result of climate change, and that's one thing. And on the other hand, that the party that's the defendant in that particular case had made a contribution that can directly be linked to climate change, that is linked to the damage that you've incurred. Now, we, from a strategic point of view, we didn't ask for damages. We asked for preventive action. So, and that's something you can do in the Netherlands. You can ask for an order. If you can show that there's a real threat of damages, of harm and casualties even, you can ask for an order to prevent this from happening. And if you're not claiming damages, you don't have to prove this last part in the causation. So you only have to prove that there's real and imminent danger that will also affect your life in a way that asks for legal protection. So that makes it a lot easier from a causation point of view. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you.